We're very fortunate to have with us today the Reverend Dr. Emma Pennington, a canon of Canterbury Cathedral, who has a special interest in English mystics. He's recorded a series which can be found on the Canterbury Cathedral YouTube page and has written a book about Julian of Norwich called At the Foot of the Cross. Emma, today we are going to be talking about the Cloud of Unknowing, and a lot of the time we'll be referring to the Cloud author, because the author of the Cloud of Unknowing is anonymous. What can we know about the writer?
Yeah, it's a bit of a shame, this one, because we really don't know very much at all about who this person might have been. So it is why we refer to him as the Cloud author. There is a corpus of writings that he's written. It's not just the Cloud itself, but we can kind of piece bits and pieces together, and it seems that he is probably quite well educated. He might have been educated through the schools. He certainly refers to some of the topical issues of the time, particularly around science in the Oxford schools. So we kind of have picked up from that. But again, it's only surmising. And we know he's writing around the late 14th century, and there's also a possibility that he was probably part of the rigorous Carthusian order. And I keep using the word he because we're pretty much sure that it probably was a he, because he's sitting in the seat of being an instructor and a guide on the contemplative path for a younger solitary. So,
what makes the Carthusian order different from other monastic orders? Very briefly.
Okay, so briefly, there are many orders around at the end of the 14th century. The thing about the Carthusians is that they were very much sort of devoted to a kind of solitary life, but within community. If you've ever been to Mount Grace Priory up in Yorkshire, there are the ruins of a Carthusian, and you can see they all have their little houses in which they live and they read and they work, and then there's one church that they might come together. So they are more like hermits living together rather than forming a community. And there's a very strict form of silence. So a bit like the Cistercian monks at the time, but they lived in community. The Carthusians lived in their own little houses, and they were notorious for their book dissemination. So a lot of the medieval texts that we have come down to us have come through that and through that order.
So we know that he was educated, very probably associated in some way with Carthusian order.
Yeah.
What else can we know about him?
I'm afraid that's about it. That's all we can know. I suppose the other thing that we could surmise is that he's sitting in the role of director. So this is a letter that he's replying to a young man, 24 years old, who's asking about the solitary life. So he's obviously a person who has some wisdom, or otherwise they wouldn't go to him. And possibly he may have been a solitary himself. So apart from that, I think that's about it, really. Yeah.
So you've said he's writing to a younger man, instructing him in a contemplative life. What is his big message?
I guess the big overarching message that we get through the Cloud, it's written to a young man who is a solitary. And when we mean solitary, we really do mean on your own, living the life of prayer and dedication to God. So the life of prayer would have been quite structured, so they would have known what prayers to say, following the liturgy of the church, which would be mirrored for the contemplative. But he's writing to a young man who is obviously come to a point in his spiritual life where he's kind of hit a wall, and it's not unknown. And so he's writing into a situation that is quite common for those people who would have been in the solitary life. And it's basically that how on earth do I pray? I've used all the tools of prayer, and I have this intense desire and yearning to know God better. And yet I find myself in this place which can only be described by the Cloud of Unknowing author as the Cloud of Unknowing. So he's all the tools of prayer are sort of falling away. And he's finding himself with just this kind of naked intent to know God. So what the Cloud author is doing is trying to help him understand what prayer is and really who God is, and how we have to change our way of praying because of how God is. Now he takes he's using a long tradition, a very old tradition that goes way, 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 way back, which is basically that we have the incarnation, and through Christ we can know everything about God through the person of Christ. But then we get to a point where the incarnation then has to, not necessarily the incarnation, but the manifestation of God within the world has to be negated to actually know God as he is, who is all unknowing, the ineffable, beyond knowledge. So the young man has used all his reasoning and all his logic to get to this place, and he finds it's failing. Now he has to make this ontological leap to start negating everything that he knows to get to the place where he sits in a place of unknowing, naked, as the Cloud author says, before the presence of who actually God is, because anything else is less than God. And that's what he's doing. So that ontological shift, and then he's giving him tools to be able to actually get to that place. So using the naked intent, he talks about wrapping that intent within a word like love and piercing the cloud of unknowing so that you actually know God as he is in himself. So that's the basic kind of, it's all about prayer. It's all about who God is, but it's all about as well our inability as human beings to know God in himself.
And before we talk about the method a little bit more, could we talk about the tradition within which the cloud sits?
So the cloud sits within, it's, as I say, it's a very old tradition, and it's best to kind of be taken back to actually where it sort of begins, right at the beginning. So if you don't mind me doing a bit of a...
Please begin at the beginning.
So the Cloud of Unknowing sits within a tradition which is known as mystical theology. And mystical theology, it sort of began around the theologian Origen in about 184 to 254. And this is all about trying to understand God as himself as he is. Okay. So there is this word called theoria, which comes from the Greek meaning contemplation. So Origen begins this kind of tradition of that you can know God as he is through the act of contemplation, which is a prayer practice. Okay. And he says they know God in creation, and so that you can contemplate what is intellectual, you can contemplate the world, you can contemplate the Bible and the person of Christ, and that will lead you to the place of God. That's what Origen starts to talk about. So he sees knowledge as leading us to union with God through the person of Jesus Christ. But then we come on to Macarius in 300 to 91, and he sees theoria slightly differently. He sees theoria not just as me contemplating God, with all my faculties, but he sees it as an encounter, much more an encounter within the human heart, an interaction between God. And it's seen as the highest gift that God can give us, which is the ability to actually know him in himself. And this is seen as being something completely unique for each individual. So we're all given the capacity to know God in himself according to our gifts. So some may have more capacity than others, all right? So it can become a bit tiered, a bit like that. So, and what's the result of that is then it kind of cultivates the virtues within us. So we become better people. We're able to love God with all our faculties, but we're able to love our neighbour as ourselves. Then we come to the Cappadocian Fathers. We're getting there. We're nearly there. And the Cappadocian Fathers are St. Basil, St. Gregory of Nyssa and St. Gregory of Nazianzus, and they are writing around 350, 400, that period. And they see theoria, this contemplation, as the highest experience that we have. So we've slaughtered in this word now, experience, not just about knowing something intellectual, it's now about experience. And they are the people who introduce this idea that actually when you experience God in himself, you get to this place where you enter a kind of darkness. And it's not a literal darkness, it's a kind of ignorance. We can't go any further with our faculties. And they bring in this idea of the cloud of unknowing, because Gregory of Nyssa uses that scriptural passage from the Bible where Moses ascends the hill, the Mount Sinai, and there he encounters God, but he doesn't see his face. He encounters him in a cloud. And that's the image that he uses to try and express this idea that, you're only really going to know God as him because of what he's not.
Is the idea there that you're closer to God in that ignorance?
Absolutely. That's entirely right. Yes, because you've actually moved beyond your human faculties, which, if you think about it, our human faculties are taking experiential sort of evidence from the outer world, but it's taking it into us, and then we process it, and then we have our minds and we create then something. So it's kind of us-centered, whereas what the cloud of unknowing places us in is a place where all our faculties are failing, and it's in that point that we have more chance of knowing God as he is in himself. So that tradition, that really strong tradition, is then taken into the 6th century, and the writer Pseudo-Dionysius, as he's known. And he writes this text called Mystical Theology. And it's that text which we know our cloud author knew, because he does a very loose translation of it called Dionysius Hid Divinity. So, it's hidden divinity of God. And it's here that God is described distinctly as being in darkness, and that theoria then becomes the process of self-emptying, kenosis, self-emptying, so that we can get to that place where we sit in that realm of God, of not knowing, not using our faculties, but reaching out into the darkness. And that's where, that's the stream which the cloud comes from. It's also got an overarching kind of description name. It's called the cataphatic tradition, or negative theology, cataphatic meaning darkness. And then, that's right, it's the apophatic tradition. The cataphatic, as you're right, I've got that confused for a minute. So the cataphatic tradition is what we can know through our manifestations of God in the world. And the apophatic is the negative theology.
And Pseudo-Dionysius is particularly important, we've said, for the cloud author as an influence. He says, I think, that what he is writing is absolutely in accord with a summary of almost Pseudo-Dionysius. He's quite an interesting figure. Could we just say a little bit about who he is?
Yeah, I don't know very much about him, but I do know that he was writing in the 6th century, and that he was very influenced by Christian Neoplatonism, which was around at that time, so which was trying to understand the Christian story of God and incarnation through the teachings of Plotinus mainly, and Plotinus as this image of the new of God, and which is equated with God. And again, it's about moving towards God and this in this sort of union with otherness and with the divine. And we often call him Pseudo-Dionysius, because I'm not entirely sure, because it gets muddled up with someone who was St. Paul knew.
Dionysius, the Areopagite,
right.
who Paul was said to have converted in.
Exactly. And that gets confused between, which is why we call him Pseudo-Dionysius, because he's not actually that person. He's writing much later in the 6th century.
Okay. So this is the tradition within which the Cloud author sits. There are other mystical traditions, and in fact, in the 14th century in England, there is a bursting out of mystical writings. Could we say a little bit, firstly, why might there be an increase in interest in mysticism or various kinds of mysticism then? And then maybe we could talk about the ways in which the Cloud author is different from some of the other authors in that period.
Yeah, absolutely. So this is a fascinating period of history. Well, I find it particularly fascinating. It's really interesting that there is this kind of flowering, particularly in vernacular religious writing. I mean, there's always lots in Latin and through the church, but this is very much vernacular, and it's writing for people, particularly at that time for those who were solitaries or seeking a contemplative life. But actually what happened was a lot of these texts were then sort of redacted and was given, little annotated so that they could be read by ordinary lay people. And it's interesting, isn't it, when you start reflecting on the world in which these texts were writing. So people were obviously seeking for something much deeper. We were seeking to know God as He is, but they were also seeking deep comfort and reassurance, because it was a pretty nightmarish time. I mean, we could say every period of history has a nightmarish aspect, but there's something about this late 14th century that really seems to tune in with our own experiences today, because we've all just come out of a pandemic. There was very much pandemic happening in the late 14th century. So, and it sounds kind of canny sometimes, some of this, I think. So there was this strange sickness that was in East Asia, in China, that people had heard about, and in 1346, and then it reached the shores of England in 1348. And within a year, it had just killed thousands of people. And by the end, 2 years later, there was estimated about a third of the population had died. And priests were particularly hit because they would go and give the last rites to folk who were dying of the Black Death, as it's known, or of bubonic plague. But of course, they didn't have vaccines like we have. And so it just went on, and every few years, it just kept coming back and coming back and coming back. So really awful time. And then there was war in Europe. So the 100 Years' War literally was 100 years of sort of battles throughout. That started in 1337. And two great dynastic families of the Plantagenets and the Valois just kind of hitting each other, and all the people who died through that in foreign lands. And then there was civil unrest. You can see there's so much parallels, isn't there?
Yeah, the peasants revolt.
Peasants revolt, which was harsh taxations. And also there was unrest within the church. So we had this group of people, which are so-called the Lollards, who were questioning church authority, really.
These are, so in relation to the Cloud author, these are the Lollards are condemned by him. So he's standing up for doctrinal orthodoxy.
Yeah, and actually that's interesting, because one of the reasons he sometimes is thought of being a priest is because of those references to standing up. So into this whole mix, you have these group of five, the five English mystical writers, as we call them. Of course, they wouldn't have called themselves that at the time. It's Evelyn Underhill, actually, writing at the beginning of the last century, who sort of grouped them together and called them mystics. They wouldn't have called themselves mystics. They would have called themselves, devotional writers or visionaries. So the first is Richard Rolle, who notoriously went an educated young man in Oxford, but was so disgusted with the aridity of the teaching of the schools of Oxford that he put on his sister's shift, which is her undergown, and ran off into the woods. And he then ended up in Yorkshire and wrote a lot of text, again, specifically for people to help them in their spiritual life. And then we have Walter Hilton, who was an Augustinian canon who was associated with the prior at Surbiton. And he wrote his sort of famous, known as the Ladder of Perfection or the Scale of Perfection, which is quite a systematic text, but again, written for one person. And that it became incredibly popular. And then we have my personal favourite, which is Julian of Norwich. So she, she's a bit like the Cloud author. We really don't know anything about her. But that's because she intentionally erases herself from a text, so you really don't know much about her. But in 1373, she had a vision of the cross. And out of that vision came a whole series of revelations. And then about 20 years later, she started, after having thought about them for years and years, she started writing them down. And we get her text, which is known as Revelation of Divine Life. Then there's Marjorie Kemp, who knew Julian of Norwich. She was in King's Lynn. She's probably the most colourful of all of them. She went on lots of pilgrimages, and she would go and speak out against the church authorities. She nearly got accused of being a Lollard herself, but she was a very bright woman, I think. And she does this text, which is sort of it's written by priests, it's held by priests, and so it feels a bit more like it's an apologetic of her life, trying to justify herself for her ministry. And then finally, we come to our Cloud of Unknowing, who sits in this group, but also is slightly different from all the groups. So it's quite an eclectic group. You couldn't say they're all the same. If you got them all in one room, it would look it'd be an interesting dinner party, let's say. But they're all writing in English. That is one of the key things, yeah.
And in what ways would the Cloud author differ from some of the others? Say you take initially Julian of Norwich. What makes their perspective so different?
Okay, so Julian sits very clearly in what you said earlier about the Catholic tradition. So she has a vision of love, of what God's love is like, but very much through the incarnation of Christ. So her vision of the cross is she looks at Christ on the cross and sees that as the ultimate expression of God's love for us. So deeply comforting to people then as it is now. So the Cloud author, he sees the importance of love, but he doesn't see the importance so much of God's love as of our love, our will, our intention. So slightly is very different, and he sees that love as being our motivating force to know God, and he sits in the apophatic tradition and says that you can only really know God if you, as we've been saying, is if you pass to the Cloud of Unknowing and then even beyond into God's divine life. Yeah.
And Marjorie Kemp, the Cloud author, would perhaps have even more problems with, because is that right?
I think you've got it spot on. Yes. So the Cloud author is quite critical of people who have visions and experiences. And let's say Marjorie Kemp had lots of visions and experiences, and would particularly be a very sort of screaming and weeping, and quite an excessive display of her experience of Christ. And also she would have lots and lots of visions where she would imagine herself into the Bible and the stories of Jesus, so that she would see herself at the at the birth of Jesus, and baby Jesus would be handed over to her to wash, do all kind of that. So that very kind of biblical, experiential. The cloud author would say, no, you've got to get beyond that, my dear, And yes, if you think about it, later people like St. Ignatius of Loyola, very much in her tradition of really getting into the biblical stories and living them and breathing them and knowing God through living scripture like that.
What exactly is the problem, according to the Cloud of Unknowing, with these kinds of ecstatic experiences?
Well, I think the problem with the ecstatic experience is that it's a very fine line between it's something that's being given to you and something that you're actually manufacturing within yourself. So even then, they had a very clear, sort of understanding of the ego. Not that they would have called it ego, but the ability for us to manufacture. He has that lovely image about the use of language as well. Be careful of the language, that don't misread my language. So when I say up, I don't mean you look up, gazing at the heavens. We've just got it all wrong. So he's very cautious about that. And also it's seen as one of those things that you also have to get rid of, you just, that's not about what God is about. It's more than that. It's more about our experiences.
That leads us nicely into talking a little bit more about the themes of the book in a little bit more detail. First of all, who is the book written for?
Well, we know it's written for this 24-year-old young man because it's addressed to him. And we know that he's had this singular calling to be a solitary, because that's right at the beginning of the text. So we know it's for him. We also get the sense that it's written for other people who are called to this contemplative lifestyle, which is, entire devotion of your life to God. And there's right at the beginning that sort of famous injunction, which says, don't just hand this around willy-nilly. Be careful who you hand this to. You must, only people who will understand what I'm talking about should read this, because there's too much in it that could be misread or misunderstood. And so only give it to those whom you feel are on the same kind of spiritual path as you are. So that we know that. And
how seriously do you think we should take this injunction? Should we not read it if we're not prepared to go and live perfectly contemplative lives?
It's a really, really good question. And it's one that I've kind of lived with, because I encountered all these texts as an English student reading medieval studies as well, English and medieval studies. So obviously I come out of the school of the English faculty, which very much looks at these texts as, in literary classics that you can criticize and pull apart. But there is part of me that also says, and then there's the other part of me, which is the priest, that says, actually, there may be something in this, just be careful. And then the pragmatic in me also kind of says, well, isn't it interesting that actually what he's done is he's helped us to approach this text with quite a serious intention. This is not about reading the newspaper on a Sunday morning. This is about sort of giving yourself to the text and understanding what the text says, rather than about what you think about it. And I find that quite an interesting and refreshing kind of way into this and how to read the injunction, because it doesn't deny anyone from reading it, which, you could if you read it in a very religious way. But it does say to us, just come to this text and let it speak to you, and try and leave your preconceptions on the door. And anyway, it's a 14th century text. So we cannot get into the mindset of a 14th century person anyway. So I think it's kind of helpful for me. Yeah.
No, I like the way he gives instructions too. It has to be read all the way through.
Yes.
And you should read it slowly.
Yes.
So when we get into the text itself, after there are prayers at the beginning and we have a preface, we get into the text and straight away he begins to explain the technique for achieving a kind of union with God that was lost after the fall. Could you tell us about that technique in a bit more detail than you did earlier? Maybe we could pause and interrogate some of the aspects of that.
Absolutely. So, as you say, he pretty much goes to the nub of the issue straight away, and is very much sort of goes in very, very quickly, goes into this whole idea about if you really want to know God, okay, if you want to know God, then it's going to take you to a place where your faculties are going to fail you. And he describes this, as we've been talking about, as the place of unknowing, or the cloud of unknowing. But it's more, if you think of it as the place of unknown. And then he says, don't worry about it. It's just quite nice. Don't freak out, but stay there. And that if you get this sense that it's actually quite difficult just to stay there. And so he gives us another cloud, which is known as the cloud of forgetting. And he says, put under your feet the clouds of forgetting. And so it encourages us to push down, so when thoughts come to the surface, is to push it down under the clouds of forgetting. It's not that. It's not that. It's not that. So if you're thinking that these people in the cells or wherever are saying a lot of rote prayers, they're saying the Lord's Prayer, they're saying the Creed, they're saying the prayers of Mary, which is lots of rote prayers. So they're using lots of images. So the medieval church was full of images and devotional acts and all these kind of things. And he's saying, don't worry about those. Don't even worry about those. Push them under your clouds of forgetting. And then when thoughts come up again, push them under the cloud of forgetting. And instead, he says, take your naked intent, which I suppose means, the singular intent, your intent to love God, and says wrap it within a word. So like put a word around it, like a word like love, and just constantly use that word to I suppose to direct all your thoughts and all your feelings to God, so that you're no longer thinking about, let's think about Mary and how lovely she is, or let's say the Lord's Prayer and what is the Lord's Prayer all about, and God in Gethsemane and all those kind of things. And you're not on these kind of imaginative world of prayer and meditation, which was very big in the medieval time, using your imagination to place yourself within the life of Christ. It's saying don't do any of that, and just be with your love alone.
So the key is to relinquish all thoughts of the self, thoughts of God, thoughts of what you're going to have for dinner, and use this mantra, almost this word, which is kind of emptied of content, because you're not meant to be meditating on the word itself, and the word is short, God or love, and you're using that to help you push down the thoughts beneath the cloud of forgetting.
Cloud of forgetting, that's right, yeah.
Okay. And then what?
And then he starts talking about obviously some of the difficulties that this is going to face, but also probably like a good tutor and everything, he starts to talk about some of the effects that this will have and how it will improve your life of virtue, and how you will see this way of being, because it's not so much a prayer. Well, it is a kind of a prayer practice, but it's not just it's more than a prayer practice. It's a kind of changes your ontological way of being, so that the world and how you interact with the world is quite different. And he talks a lot about the image of Martha and Mary. So Martha being the active life. So the story of, as you probably know, the story of Martha and Mary, and Martha is always busy, and Mary is sitting at the feet of Jesus, sort of, just listening in awe, and he literally does divide this, as they did at that time, interpret it as two ways of being, two ways of life. One, the active world, where you have to get on with life and do all the things, and one where you are a solitary and a contemplative, and you purely sit at the feet of Jesus. Now, he does say that these two are not always quite as separated as they appear. There are good aspects of the active life, and part of your life will be active, but he does say it is the contemplative, the Mary in you, which is the one you really need to cultivate, the one of the sitting at the feet of Jesus. And so he's quite practical like that in seeing that life is quite complex, but for you to strive for the solitary and the perfect life.
Yeah, so is there no doubt that the contemplative life is actually the superior?
Oh, absolutely. He's very clear about that. I mean, he's sort of aware of the active life, but it's, it's like, then that's very second best, which is why we throughout, you do get this sense in the interpretation of that parable that, are you an active or are you a contemplative, Whereas I think in modern thinking, we'd probably say that most of us have a Martha and a Mary within us, but he's very clear that Mary's way of life is the better, and you must pursue that over above the active life. So yeah.
Okay, and we've talked about some of the benefits of the contemplative life. He even goes so far, I think, as to say that it actually makes you look better. But could we talk a little bit about the experience of attaining union with God, or something like a union with God?
Yeah, so I think for the Cloud author, this is something that is very fleeting. He doesn't say that you won't ever have union with God, and I suppose that is known as, so you have the different orders of life, to the active, the contemplative, but then also part of the contemplative is the perfect, and the perfect is union with God. And so experience of that, he expresses as something it is very, very fleeting, and that most of our life is spent within the cloud of unknowing. And if we are gifted that those moments of realization, then that, in a sense, is the goal. But also, he's very clear that that the union with God is only ever in this life a precursor of the next life, when we have the beatific vision. So in a sense, he kind of says it's what you must aim for, but also actually it's only you're just getting an insight into what it's going to be like later. And so that can be quite comforting in a sense, because it means that if you're not gifted with that, then this is something that you will be given when you come face to face with God Himself in the next life, the beatific vision.
And if we're aiming at it, we should be aiming at it with a sharp dart of longing love.
Yeah.
What does he mean by that?
It's an interesting one, isn't it? The sharp dart of longing love. I mean, I guess that this also has a kind of biblical idea as well, going back to the sort of the trying to penetrate the cloud with your love and your desire. But also there is that other aspect to the sort of mystical world where God is seen as sending a dart of love into the heart of the Christian, who then is filled with love. So it's a kind of reversal of that, so God sends a dart of his love that sort of breaks the beloved heart and makes her desire God. And the response to that is to send our dart of love back to the cloud of unknowing. So I think that's where that image comes from.
We spoke a little bit earlier about our concepts being only at best approximations of God, which is why we need to let them go to draw closer to God. And we spoke about language specifically and prepositions and the metaphors not reaching to God. That's been a part of the cloud that's particularly interested people in the 20th century as philosophy became focused on language. Yeah. People see similarities in the work of Wittgenstein and so forth. Could we talk about the philosophy of language that's sometimes latent, sometimes explicit in the Cloud of Unknowing?
Yeah, it's interesting. Yeah, I did a little bit of a study about it's Bertrand Russell and all that. It's sort of group, and the how do you talk about something which is ineffable? We should just be silent because it's ineffable. And so he is really cautious about the use of language, that actually even the language we use is not enough to talk about God. And so in a sense, you get this feeling that actually when we talk about God, we have to either keep saying, well, this isn't who God is, we have to keep apologizing in a sense and say we're only using fallen words, and words have interpretation and different meanings, so we have to keep qualifying our words. Or there is an actual sense in which the only real response to God is silence. And I guess that's why the Cloud of Unknowing has been so seminal for a lot of the modern contemplative practices, which are using this kind of practice to take people into a place of deep, deep silence where words are no longer needed, external words, but also internal words of the machinations of the mind. So the centering prayer technique and, Christian meditation, which also builds on Eastern meditation, taking you to a place where language is just seen as, once again needs to be negated. But it's quite, it's the thing I quite like about him, and I think the way he sort of laughs a bit at the way people get the language wrong, I think is quite helpful. Is quite helpful, particularly in as I work in the church where language is very wordy and we use a lot of words, and so to remind you that actually at some point, you must use the words as springboards to know God, rather than think the words contain God somehow.
Yes, and I think his warning about words misleading, prepositions misleading, leading you to think that God is up in heaven and so forth, are useful warnings. I think it's very easy to be misled by language and to read literally metaphors where they don't belong in religious and other contexts.
Yeah,
you spoke about the influence the cloud has had on contemplative prayer movements. How has it been received and interpreted over this century since it was written?
Again, it's an interesting question, and when you consider what an amazing little text this is, actually, it really didn't disseminate very far at the time. We only have 17 manuscripts of the Cloud, which is not many when you consider that there really are quite a lot of Richard Rohr. So there may be something about that period, because Julian is similar. We have very few manuscripts of hers, and there was so at the beginning of the 15th century, there was pretty much a clampdown by Archbishop Arundel on teaching within the church, and also how who could teach, who could write, and possibly as a response to the Lollard movement. And so it may be that a lot of these texts that were being read by ordinary people pretty much went underground, and it might be that the Cloud, a bit like Julian, just went underground and it was circulated by only a few people. There were 2 Latin translations of it in the 15th century, but then it wasn't really until Augustine Baker in the 17th century we then made it more well known, and then the text really came to light, a bit like Julian and a number of the other texts with those early 20th century Evelyn Underhill, those people who were really rediscovering these texts. And from there, I have to say, I think it's taken off. Had lots of translations, not so many editions of the Middle English, because it's not the easiest of Middle English to read. Unlike Julian, where her Middle English has been updated by sort of scribes over the years in the 17th, 16th, 17th century. That hasn't happened to the Cloud, and so you do get quite a dense Middle English text. So most people would read it in the translation, and all that influence that it's had on modern contemplative practices, I think, is really interesting. So it's still seminal for English faculties to know and read about, and even some philosophy. But it's really, I think, would say, in the world of the contemplative prayer movement of the last 10, 20 years, that it's really had quite an impact. Yeah.
One thing I meant to ask earlier.
Yeah.
There are some more challenging passages that you get in the Cloud, which are about the devil and are actually quite graphic. How should we understand his focus on the devil in these?
Well, I think this is once again when you do suddenly realise that you are reading a 14th century text, and in a sense, the language that he's using is not necessarily the language that we would understand anymore. I always, whenever I get all those sort of texts about the devil and all that kind of stuff,
Seeing hell through the devil's nostril and stuff like that.
It's all, I mean, part of me just loves it because it's so graphic. And I don't know if you've ever been to Fairford Church, where they have these most amazing stained glass windows of devils. It's just phenomenal. It's incredible. So there's something very graphic about the medieval church. There's something very visceral, and one of the things I quite like about it is that what they're doing is using these images of the devil in a very objective way. Okay, and I think that's quite helpful. Whereas today, a lot of what we understand as evil is actually we see as within ourselves, and in a sense that can be quite more horrendous, really. Whereas because you have these objectifications of what is perceived as evil, there's a sense in which you can look it squarely in the face and actually react and respond against it. Whereas with the modern concepts of everything within, that's a much harder battle, I think. So, it's medieval text. You've got to take it on its own terms and also try and understand what is lying behind the language. Why is he using that language? To try and help you understand, which is what I would say. Because Julian is similar. She has texts where the devil is sitting on her chest, sort of laughing at her, and also she has lots of blood, streaming blood, and some people just go, can't deal with that. It's this whole thing about come to a medieval text and try to let the text speak to you and look behind the language and say, well, why? What's this language using? How's it being used? And what's it trying to say that actually I could get from it? because there's always something we can get from these texts.
And he wants to emphasize the dangers of being misled and heading down a wrong prayer path, or deceiving oneself into thinking one's having, in the context of revelations, when one is just exercising imagination under the influence of a nefarious power of some sort.
Absolutely. And I think Richard Roll has this beautiful image, the devil comes as an angel of light. And I love that, because if you just think of the times when you're like really puffed up and you're really, I'm so successful, actually you're quite vulnerable then to, not listening to, caring about other people, being very self-centered, being a bit narcissistic, so that there is, as you say, that behind these images, there is something that can help us understand ourselves better and God better.
And that's another theme running through the book, modesty or humility. And he asks the novice to pray for his modesty, and he says that in order to embark on these contemplative practices in the first place, you need to be humble and without sin, and you have sin, you need to go and confess and be absolved of sins before beginning. But he always comes back to humility, modesty. Why is that so important for him particularly?
I think it's probably that this, what we were just talking about, this capacity of the human heart to deceive itself, and it's the gift of humility, which actually helps us see us as who we really are, not what we think we are. And also, of course, one of the humility is the counterpoint to pride, and pride is the chiefest of all the sins, and pride, spiritual pride, particularly in this area, is very dangerous. So it's very easy to go and say, I've been specially called out by God to this way of life. That's all spiritual pride. So which is why he keeps going back to humility. Also, I mean, they had you have to remember in the medieval church that they had a very robust understanding of the nature of sin. So they had all these kind of species and different definitions, and they knew all the 7 deadly sins, and they knew all the, and they would use all that for their confession. So they had this whole understanding of all the different ways that we can sin. And at the root of all of that, the one virtue that can really counteract all of those is humility. So it's going to what is the real virtue that is the most important that you have, and that's humility, and that's why he keeps going back to that. But I find it interesting in all of these texts, all of the mystics, and particularly Richard Roll and Walter Hilton, is they're very, very keen to point out that the spiritual life only comes out of the moral life. You really need to have got your house in order, before you can start thinking about the life of contemplation. And I think too often in our modern world, just so we can cut out the moral life, and go, what are the nice bits in contemplation? But no, they always have it in this bedrock of you really got to try and sort out your inner world. I think the Cloud author talks about sin as a big lump. Well, we have lumps in our world, don't we? And try to deal with it as a lump, as a cancer even. Getting rid of that, so that you are then freed to be able to contemplate God.
If people read the Cloud of Unknowing and they enjoy it, is there anything else you'd particularly recommend that they look into?
What, in sort of background reading, or
in terms of either background reading to help them understand it better, or in terms of reading other mystics or other writers who they might also enjoy?
So there are some sort of interesting books that you can pick up on secondary information. One of the good ones is called The Darkness of God, which is by Dennis Turner. So that looks at the negativity in Christian mysticism. So that looks at the whole background out of which the cloud author comes. Then if you're interested in the kind of English faculty area, Marion Glasgow wrote this book, which is called Games of Faith, which is about the English mystics. That's really useful. And that tells you all about, that goes much more into the language. We've just touched upon it here, but that really goes into the language and how he's using language in his texts in different ways. But she looks at all the medieval mystics. And then there's another good one, which is called the Cambridge Companion to Medieval English Mysticism. That's a combination with Vincent Gillespie and Samuel Fanas. And that really gives you that sort of paints the landscape of the devotional writing of that sort of period and puts it within a much more detailed historical context. So that's the kind of, the overview, the much larger. What I'm going to say, read Julian.
Absolutely.
If you like the cloud, read Julian, and also read some of Richard Roll. So Richard Roll, he's The Form of Living is probably one of his best texts, which is probably the most comparable to the Cloud of Unknowing, and it's only comparable in the sense of that it was written for someone in the solitary life, but it makes a really good sort of, and this is another way you could do it, and it's complete contrast in what he's actually saying, but there's something that's kind of similar underneath, which is about moving towards knowing God better.
Yeah, that sounds interesting. I would add, of course, that your next mystic should be Julian of Norwich, and you should read Emma Pennington's At the Foot of the Cross to help you through it. But Emma, thank you very much for guiding us through a difficult text.